Well, welcome everyone to this Federalist Society virtual event. As this afternoon, now a federal holiday, and thank you for joining us if you are joining us, but we apologize. It was not a federal holiday in our defense when we scheduled the event, but we decided to go ahead, and thanks to our speakers for joining us at this time. So today, June 18th, 2021, we have a discussion on China, the US, and global climate policy, cooperation or competition. I'm Nick Marr, Assistant Director of Practice Groups here at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that expressions of opinion on our call today are those of our experts. We're very pleased to be joined by two experts. I'm going to introduce them both. First, I'll start with our moderator, Mr. Dan West. He's Vice President at SCF Partners, and he's also a member of our International and National Security Law Practice Group Executive Committee, the sponsoring group of this program today. We're also joined by Mr. Gabriel Collins. He's the Baker Botts Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs, the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute. They have longer bios. They've done lots more things, so you can check out those bios on our website. Also, to our audience, we'll be looking to you for questions as we go along, so please submit those questions via the chat, and they'll be picked out at that point. So with that, and without further ado, Mr. Daniel West, I'll give the floor to you.
Great, thanks, Nick, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today we'll discuss global climate policy and its impacts on international relations, with a focus on China and the United States. We'll start by discussing the aspirational goals that these countries have expressed in recent years, along with an assessment of their actions to date toward achievement of those goals. We'll also discuss the legal frameworks through which these countries attempt to implement policies to achieve the goals that their leaders set. And finally, we'll discuss the relative priority that each country places on the climate issue among the various objectives that they seek to achieve in the international arena, and what that implies for the strategic interactions between the US and China. So let's jump in. China made headlines last year when government leaders announced a target of carbon neutrality by 2060. And that announcement seems to have won China significant praise and credibility from thought leaders and world governments. But Gabe, as you noted in your recent piece, 65% of Chinese electricity comes from coal, a proportion that's much higher than OECD countries, and China continues to grow its coal-fired power supply. In fact, the entire world last year retired a net of 17 gigawatts of coal-fired generation capacity, only for China to add 30 gigawatts. Can you talk a bit about the commitments that China has made, both in the near term and the long term, and how do China's promises compare to its actions so far?
Certainly, and thank you to all of you for being with us here today, and thank you for the question, Dan. So, we have this very ironic disjuncture between China and the United States, where the United States, at least, for much of the past 5 to 6 years in rhetorical terms, has been viewed by the rest of the world as being very retrograde on climate. But when you look at what we've actually done versus, what some of our government officials have said from time to time, is we've actually increased our primary energy uses while reducing emissions. And a big part of this is because of the natural gas supply boom we've had, the energy abundance that fracking has brought us. We've seen greater investments in deployment of renewables and so forth. China, it's been a little bit of the opposite. We've seen some very aspirational climate statements, but as you pointed out in the question you're asking me, they've added a very significant amount of coal capacity. And just to kind of flesh that number out a little bit more for the audiences, if we go back to 2014 and look at 2014 through 2020, China has they've constructed about as much coal-fired power capacity as the US has deployed in entirety in our country. And we by ourselves are still one of the world's biggest coal users. And so I think what we're seeing is something where they've realized there are relatively easy diplomatic brownie points to score by saying certain things, but they also realize that to run a modern industrial economy, you need stable and reliable energy supplies. And in most cases, a country will gravitate toward what it has in abundance. For us, that happens to be natural gas first and foremost. And in China, that happens to be coal. And so, we see that still very pervasive in their energy system. And that's likely to be the status, that's sort of the baseline for many years to come.
Got it. Yeah. So I mean, so it seems safe to say China is not achieving dramatic improvements in its emissions profile today. In fact, it's probably going the direction. What do you think is the biggest reason for that to be the case, Dave? Is it a question of motives? Is it economics? Is it national security? Is it about institutional capacity for governance within the country itself, sort of enforcing the mandates that they'd like to enforce? What's the biggest driver there?
I think it's incentives. I mean, we'll sort of quietly and jokingly refer to what I call the VII index when we're looking at human or country behavior, and it's values, interests, and incentives. And it's sort of like a big game of paper, rock, scissors. It's great to make normative value statements, but if those start to conflict with your interests, you find that sometimes values get set aside pretty fast. And if certain interests start to conflict with incentives, then the interests get set aside. And the reason why I use this framework here is there is a very legitimate set of interests. And I think it's recognized by a fair amount of the upper echelons of the Communist Party apparatus in China that the environmental status quo, especially built on the legacy of pollution that we have, overhanging from the last 30 years or so, is something that is not fundamentally sustainable in the long term. And it's starting to become a real issue with some of the more affluent urban populations that are getting to a point where, you're beyond a subsistence, level of living, and you actually do want to see blue skies instead of coal haze, and so forth. But I think one of the things that's really challenging is, especially when you go to start trying to pull coal out of the system there, is the economic presence, both in terms of employment and in terms of the capital value of assets that exist and are operating today, and all the actors that have stakes in those. It's enormous. You imagine some of the pejorative discussion we get in this country about big oil and the influence that people think it has over the political process. If you talk about big coal in China, it's probably an order of magnitude beyond that. I mean, you're talking an employment value chain that has tens of millions of people in it, and probably collectively has trillions of dollars of deployed assets. And what I use as kind of my cautionary tale is when you look at how much trouble China's had enforcing fishing restrictions on its own fishermen and its exclusive economic zone. And a lot of those implementation problems boiled down to local officials not wanting to break people's economic rice bowls. The challenges with the coal sector are so much broader and deeper that I think whatever we've seen in other areas where you had these often locally driven implementation challenges, that's only going to be magnified when we're talking coal. And I guess to cap my response to it is, what I tend to look at when I'm assessing where China is going to go over the next 10 or 20 years on this is not the statements that are made at international diplomatic fora. It's some of the internal discussion. And I refer in particular to an October 2019 speech by Premier Li Keqiang, who talked about coal essentially being a foundational energy resource for the country's energy security and industrial development. And that's a statement I'd be a lot more willing to hang my hat on than some of the more rose-tinted pronouncements we get at international climate events from the Chinese delegations.
That makes sense. And the incentives of the local officials are often skewed as well, right? I mean, we discussed previously Yancheng Wang's book about internal politics in China and about how often the local officials will feel vague pressure on environmental issues, but their metric specifically that they're seeking to achieve is GDP based. And when those two are in tension, often like many humans, they'll follow the incentives and want to be promoted and want to have a future career path. So can you talk a little bit about how that looks at the ground level in China?
Absolutely. And we're seeing this in spades as they work to juice economic growth, as they start to come out of the lockdown-induced GDP hit we saw last year. In 2020, China smelted 1 billion tons of steel, which is an all-time high. They had record aluminum output, record cement output. And one of the things that we found in our research that was really noteworthy is for years we've tracked the sales of excavators, because basically what we were looking for originally is what is a good lead indicator that is harder for the government to manipulate or lie about? And we figured excavators are great because if you're a local contractor, you're not going to go shell out a six-figure amount of money for a big piece of complex iron unless you think you can actually put that thing to work and make the money back. And excavator sales in 2020 reached an all-time high, and I think are pretty clearly are exceeding levels that you would expect just for fleet recapitalization, because there was another big boom about 10 years ago when, lo and behold, we had another infrastructure-based stimulus package in the wake of the 2008 crisis. But I think when you look at the data now, we've gone way beyond recapitalizing, to getting old equipment out of the fleet that's left over from that. And it's really, people with their ear to the ground locally thinking, hey, there's a lot more construction and other projects coming down the road. And so, coming back to your point there, I think it's something where economic growth trumps almost everything else. And we're seeing that start to show up in a really big way, that we're right back to infrastructure and real estate, which has really been a lot of the Chinese domestic growth engine, basically for the last 15 years, and it's very emissions intensive, and it looks like that's going to continue.
Yeah. Let's shift gears to the United States. So in these international fora, China is making certain promises and getting certain credit out of it. Other nations making promises. What are the promises that our federal government has made to the rest of the world over the past decade or so? Including the Paris Climate Agreement and the goals that President Biden recently set at the climate summit that he convened. Can you talk about what is the agenda that we've been bringing to the world from the United States perspective?
Exactly. And so I think for this one, what it really centers on the most are probably some of the statements we've seen over the last few months from the Biden administration, where we have some very aggressive emissions targets, reduction targets looking out to 2030 and beyond, where basically, I think things that, they're of the same magnitude of some of the aspirational statements we've seen from China in the past, except we're starting from a much tougher baseline because we're already a lot less carbon intensive. I mean, if you look at CO2 emissions per million BTU of energy, primary energy consumed economy-wide, China right now, I think last year it was about 73, or 2019 is the last year we have data. I think it was 73 kilograms of CO2 per million BTU. We're at about 53 here, which is basically what you get burning natural gas. So not surprising seeing how gas-centric we are. And to kind of put that in perspective, I ran the numbers for Norway, which is probably the poster child for something akin to a post-carbon economy, and it's about 20 kilograms. And so what we're committing ourselves to is something between where we are now and, where Norway is now in terms of emissions intensity. And, these are goals that are reachable, but not every path is made equally. And the sense I get when you look at a lot of the talk, particularly coming out of Washington, is this is something that they want to be very much centered on intermittent renewables. And I think the hard, cold realities, if we want to, remain a premier global industrial power, there's ways we can get good, reliable baseload energy that is very low carbon, but that involves doing a lot more in the nuclear space. And I don't see a broad, at least at the high federal level, political appetite. Now, I think ironically, this may be something where some of the states that have historically been denigrated for maybe not being as forward thinking on some of these issues. And I'm thinking of, particularly parts of the Deep South. You have the TVA and you have the nuclear presence in the Carolinas already, in Georgia. I think if those licenses were extended and some of those facilities are expanded, we can compensate for policy challenges that are being created in other parts of the country. But I think basically to kind of, sum this up into a nutshell to your original question, there is the magnitude of the challenge that the Chinese face if they actually want to act according to their words is greater than the one we face. But I think the likelihood that we're going to hold ourselves to what we said is a lot higher than them holding themselves to what we said. So to what they said. So that probably, in reality, we're going to really face tough implementation challenges of a somewhat different variety here.
And different time horizons too, right, Gabe?
Yes.
International relations is driven by bargains, and people have values and interests, and they interact, and folks make deals. And could you just talk a little bit about the time frame, the pledges that we're making, and the time frame we're making them versus when China would be expected to deliver on the pledges that they're making.
Exactly. And that's, I'm glad you asked. That's a huge distinction. They tend to center their discussion, especially for the big high level targets, around the 2050 to 2060 timeframe. We're centered more around the 2030 timeframe. And what you see over and over, and this isn't just something that, falls on the Chinese. I mean, you see this even in climate projections and adaptation and energy sector, change and energy transition projections in our own countries. There's this huge tendency to back end things, which I think, if we were to put it bluntly, is, I'll make the promises while I'm in office now, and then we'll kick it a few terms down the line for somebody.
No one would ever do something like that in a corporation or a government. Right?
Exactly. And so I think the deal is the backloading dynamic is much more in their favor. I mean, I think it's something where, and again, I'll reveal my roots as a, Permian Basin, West Texan, who maybe speaks a little too bluntly on some of these things, is we may end up inadvertently making ourselves the crash test dummy, because we're targeting 2030-ish timeframe for hitting targets, and they're targeting something that's, 2 to 3 decades beyond that. And we've seen this theme before, them wanting to be in second mover position so they can try to learn from others' mistakes. And I do think we're at a real, we're starting to see some of those things unfold here. But I think there's a question, though, and I'll cheat a little bit and insert a question of my own here, in part in response to yours. Is one thing we have to think about that's a little different here is the population gets a much more direct and very different type of say in how these things go. You can start big state level and, even federal level initiatives, but ultimately those have to survive election cycles. And I think if there's too much disruption and too much cost imposed on voters, you see a backlash here potentially down the road that could actually really change trajectories. Whereas I think in the Chinese context, it's not just a push a button and things happen. I mean, the leadership there, I think, tries to be very attuned to what the population is thinking, but the population won't get the same kind of seat at the table and voice in the transition that, our American electorate will hear.
Absolutely. It's a great point. And we've seen it elsewhere, right? I mean, in France, the Yellow Jacket movement, the Gilets Jaunes, was largely driven by opposition to high energy prices, which tend to impact those in lower income brackets rather than those in higher income brackets. It's a bigger fraction of the paycheck.
Exactly.
On that point, could you talk a little bit about our government? So obviously thankfully, we have a different form of government here than they do in the People's Republic of China. And as you mentioned, I mean, our government has to implement these policies as it tries to. So what legal power does the Biden administration or any U.S. administration have under current law to implement or to achieve promises that they make in these international fora? And how have, President Obama, President Trump, now President Biden, how have they used the practical levers available to them to impact U.S. emissions?
Certainly. And that's also, I guess, given that we're, probably all or most of us on this call are lawyers, obviously a very apropos one. I think at the risk, again, of giving a somewhat crude answer to this, there's the legal authorities you have, and then there's the ability to sustain those, especially in the face of a political environment that's probably going to be not only adverse in many instances, but I think, when you look at many of the states that are going to carry weight in this, obviously California is kind of a special case, because you would think at face value, in political terms, a lot of these energy transition efforts would be welcomed and then some. I think we might see that shift over time. I think you'll see some of the elites in California, at least people at the very top of the socioeconomic ladder, remaining supportive. As far as the rest of the population, if we see more blackouts and brownouts, if we see energy prices rise, I think that's more up for grabs than people think. I think when you come down to Texas, maybe we illustrate the other extreme. I mean, we saw a bill pass in this, last legislative session here that basically says if you want to boycott fossil fuels in any sort of financial and capital pool that's affiliated with the state of Texas will try to not do business with you. Now, there's obviously a lot of nuances around the edge and how that will be implemented, but I think it broadly reflects the political attitude. And so I think it's something where certain areas will be fairly unencumbered. I mean, I think in terms of how the administration wants to approach, offshore wind resource development, I think in terms of how they want to approach oil and gas leasing and development, certainly in the federal offshore, maybe in some of the bigger, federal reserves, you think of like Anwar in Alaska and places like that. I think they have a fairly...
Plus in New Mexico as well, the portion of the Permian in New Mexico.
In New Mexico. And yeah, there they actually just got, you're already seeing the legal backlash start there because they've just had a federal court step in and say, look, like you guys still need to continue with the leasing there. And so I think, when you're far offshore, I mean, I guess, and, I'll use this on purpose since you're a former Marine, as you think about military training areas, especially for aerial stuff, you go offshore and the world's your oyster. You can fly supersonic, you can fly low, you can fly loud, you can do whatever you want. Once you get onshore, even if you're nominally in federal areas, if you're in airspace over a federal range and your sonic boom breaks windows on state and private land off those range premises, there's probably going to be some repercussions for it. And I think that analogy holds to some extent, on these energy issues, although probably in a different way that, on one hand, maybe the first group that you'll hear from are the ones whose economic interests are affected, like to use your New Mexico example, if somebody paid $95,000 an acre for lease rights on BLM land there, they're going to be pretty concerned if there's any sort of drilling moratoria or anything like that imposed. Whereas I think the next phase, and this will be something that will probably unfold more fully over the next 2 to 5 years, is what happens on the consumer side as certain steps are taken and some of these things start to percolate deeper into the economy and affect more people. And I think that's going to shape some of the legal environment and the legal, responses and, ultimately the level of latitude that the administration has to do things at a federal level on some of these fronts.
Got it. So there are some levers at the federal level that can be pulled, but also some challenges there. Authority is much more decentralized in the United States. So talk a bit, I mean, you mentioned California, you mentioned BlackRock. Talk a little bit more just about those state and private actors, right? Are you concerned from an energy production perspective in the United States about, whether the U.S. will be able to ramp up energy production in the way that they might like to, given capital constraints, given state regulations, given pipeline and infrastructure constraints? Or on the other hand, could you talk about how that looks and how those different actors at the state and the private level, can impact the U.S.'s ability, A, to reduce emissions and B, to produce energy?
Exactly. And so I'll answer what I think is still complicated, but maybe an easier part of that question, or a more straightforward part first. And that is, we know we have the resource base at the right price level, particularly when you're talking about oil and gas and, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing completions and so forth. I think with the capital question there, one of the things that I think we're going to tease out, especially, we're here at $70 oil more or less. And, if you would have had $70 oil back in 2017, every single highway out in the Permian would be an impassable convoy of trucks heading to the next frack job or the next drill site. Clearly we see a lot more capital discipline now. What I think is going to be interesting is if we do move up closer to $100 a barrel, how long that holds for, because, I think a lot of the ESG initiatives to date have, there's been great success on the tactical front. What I mean by tactical front is, for instance, restrictions on flaring and things like that. And I think those are very congruent with what most capital providers want to see anyway, because I think often a cleanly run company is a well-run company that probably, if you look at a big empirical sample, will tend to deliver better returns to shareholders. And so obviously, if you're an investor, you want to see that. I think, though, we're now getting to a strategic stage where, now that we're seeing some of these ESG advocates getting corporate board seats, including at major oil companies, we're seeing them in influential positions in some of the capital providing outfits, BlackRock, obviously, first and foremost among those, some of the pension funds. What I think is interesting is if they start seeing a world where they envision real returns again, will they still want to keep the same kind of brakes on the company's drilling and development plans they do now? Because I think, for the last year or so, we've been in this happy period where you can look really green and pro ESG and keep the brakes on the company. And you can talk about it being motivated by environmental reasons. But I think probably, to be blunt, the biggest factor is they don't want to see drilling when they're not
when the returns are terrible, right? They don't
want to see the returns.
Destroyed.
Exactly. But I think if you start seeing, people's models beginning to indicate to them that, okay, if we let off the brakes a little bit, let's let this train start moving down the hill a lot faster, we can still get our returns. That's going to be the really interesting test. I mean, bringing us back to my favorite, values, interests, and incentives index. I think we've been in the V phase for most of the last year, and I think we're going to see interests and incentives start to really collide if oil prices go higher. And so I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I have a suspicion that the temptation of returns, if we move toward WTI at 90 or 100 a barrel, we're going to start seeing some people break with the pack, and people like us will write nice eloquent statements to the that go out publicly that explain how this is congruent with all the values we talked about. But ultimately you'll see a set of behavior that's probably more returns oriented.
Yeah, and as you mentioned previously, right, the incentives and interest change also for the voters if they're paying more than double what they used to be paying at the pump than for their electricity bill. So
yes.
It's an interesting dynamic. So let's shift back so we talked about China, talked about the U.S. Now let's talk a bit about the interaction between the two. So the climate issue, by definition, is a global one, but the level of priority placed on the issue can vary significantly from country to country. Right? How much does a given country care about this issue, and what are they willing to give up for it? As we've seen, it seems to be high on the list for the United States. So President Biden explicitly stated in an executive order that he said, quote, "It's the policy of my administration that climate consideration shall be an essential element of the United States foreign policy and national security." The one, particularly salient example of this priority in action was the shutdown of the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have resulted in domestic energy jobs, domestic energy production, concurrently with the decision to allow the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to go forward, which allowed Russia to export more natural gas to Western Europe, right? So different priorities there domestically and abroad. So I'd like to ask you, where does China rank global emissions reductions among its other economic, political, and security interests? And what about other important actors on the international stage, like Russia or India? And how might, to the extent that those countries have different priorities than the United States, how might those different priorities on the issue of emissions and climate impact the course of international relations?
Certainly. And this is a great question. And so, if we start with President Biden's statement there, and we look at some of the pattern of action subsequently, when you see those kinds of things and you're entering into high stakes diplomatic interactions with the Chinese, it's a little bit scary because you can clearly see the exploitation point or the potential exploitation point if we have made climate a central founding principle of our foreign and national security policies, whereas for them, it's a talking point on a list of 25 things where, it's a continuum and it varies depending on how you ask the question. Like if you ask, how important are climate and emissions to you just in isolation, the answer you're likely to get is very important. But if you juxtapose that against other concerns like social stability, economic growth, security of energy supplies, China's future industrial competitive, ranking and position relative to the United States and Japan and South Korea and other competitors, I think it starts to drop lower down the list. And I think this is something that, this isn't like a one-time issue. You just recognize it and then you can move on. I think this is going to be a thing that we have to continually deal with, where we've made very clear this is a high priority for us. I think, those in China who are advising President Xi are well versed enough in, what we do and how we operate here to realize that's not a monolithic opinion. But nonetheless, if it's coming from the White House, they know it carries weight, and that it's something where I think we are going to see. I mean, we've already seen this from foreign ministry spokesmen, on multiple occasions where they've made very clear, if you, the United States, want us to work with you on climate issues, then you need to have a less interference-oriented attitude toward Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Taiwan and some of these other, issues that, I think are very important to us just from a purely objective security perspective. And so I think this is going to be an ongoing struggle. I think one dimension also in this that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out is to see if and how China goes about trying to cultivate various groups domestically. We call them climate influence operations in a follow-on report that, we'll probably put out in about, 2 to 3 weeks from now. We've seen them try this for decades with the business community where, you'll have people in the Pentagon and other parts of government that want to take a much harder line. The Chinese will see this and they'll enlist some of their contacts in the business world here to try to get policies softened a little bit. I think we still don't fully know how that plays out on the climate front, because it'd be a very different constituent having to cultivate and engage with. But I think we see enough and know enough already to know that these are going to be enduring issues, and I think there's going to be important concrete information that'll come to light over the next couple of years as we see this play out. But I think, and I think we're very clear about this in our foreign affairs piece, is what we don't want is something where we make concrete upfront concessions, basically sort of proverbially speaking, where we pay cash up front and they make some back-ended promise that for various reasons they may never fulfill. I think it's not a position we want to put ourselves in. We're going to have to be very, very watchful over the next, few years here as some of these things are in flux, to make sure that we don't compromise major long-term interests in exchange for essentially a definite maybe from their side.
Got it. I'd like to pause here for a second and ask anybody in the audience that has a question, just remind everyone, please use the chat box to submit that question, and we'll turn to those in a few minutes here. So we'd love to field your questions in the audience if you have them, submit them through the chat box here. But Gabe, so you mentioned, there are disadvantages if you're bargaining with a counterparty who cares less about the outcome on a certain issue, right? And international relations, you don't take them seriatim, right? Like you have to do kind of this whole bundle all at once. And if you move on one thing, they might move on another thing, and you're juggling these things all at once in diplomacy. So when we're dealing with somebody who might care less about this than we do, how should the United States respond to this? Do they have to let China win on other issues to gain their cooperation on climate? There's laundry list: human rights in certain places, as you mentioned, international trade, intellectual property, cybersecurity, so many things that we deal with them on that. Do we have to give up success on those other issues, and would that be worth it for a climate debate? Or is there another way? And I guess in your writing, it's a leading question. You propose competition. You propose competition rather than supplication. So I'd love to hear you talk about what would a strategy like that look like, where we don't have to give on one to gain on another.
Exactly. So I think what you're asking is, how do we respond when we have an onside kick? Do we want to chase the bouncing ball and get ourselves obliterated, or do we go ahead and send our first line after their kicking team, and then our hands guys in the back can catch the ball? Well, in response to the leading question, I think we've made our views fairly clear in the foreign affairs piece, and I'll just unpack it very briefly for the audience here. Is our view is that we should not be in a cooperation-oriented rush toward China and toward this trap that they're, I think very clearly trying to set. This is not at all to say that there shouldn't be action on the energy transition front. To the contrary, even if we start work here without having to do everything in lockstep with the Chinese, the United States by itself, basically, more or less 1 in every 5 units of primary energy, not quite that much. I think it's maybe 15% of global primary energy use is here in our own country. So we can already make a huge dent with things that we've already been engaged with, for the better part of 20 years now, and that I think are going to gain steam moving forward. And I think part of the reason why the domestic work is so important is we need to make sure we're credible with our allies and partners in Europe, in Japan, and South Korea, the other OECD countries, I think also India, basically between the OECD countries and also this emerging Quad alignment we see with the US and India, Japan, and Australia, to balance some of the revisionist behavior we've seen from China. We have to really make sure we're credible with our partners, and putting ourselves in a situation where we look like a supplicant to the Chinese is not going to increase that credibility. Whereas I think taking concrete steps, first and foremost, domestically to improve our emissions profile while also preserving our industrial competitiveness are critical. And I think concurrently with this, we really want to work to build we call it loosely a carbon coalition, where when you start to think about, among other things, carbon taxation and a carbon border adjustment tax, if you can create a coalition that, we calculated with this grouping of countries, you're talking over 40% of global GDP. That is something that's big enough to get Chinese attention. And if they realize that, okay, to export certain products into these markets, if we don't structurally change how we source our energy, we're going to be at an economic disadvantage and, essentially be taxed for this. That's where I think the incentive leverage is generated. And so I think we want to generate the leverage first and then start sitting down at the diplomatic table with them. Sitting down when you don't have the leverage generated yet, I think it's not a guarantee of a bad outcome, but the recipe for trouble already has a lot of the ingredients stirred in, if that's the approach you take. But better to start with leverage than not.
That makes a lot of sense. Just remind everybody in the audience here, if you want to submit a question, feel free to do so in the Zoom chat. And my last question for you, Gabe, is, you mentioned energy transition. That's a phrase that's being battled a lot, especially both of us sit here in Houston, and Houston's the energy capital of the world and expects to remain so. And so that phrase, energy transition, gets batted around a lot, and it can mean challenges. And a lot of the climate conversation talks about how do we cut emissions, and it's an important discussion. But what about opportunities? How have those opportunities played out for China in terms of their economy, specifically with renewables and solar? What about in the United States, and even here in Texas? I think particularly we have a great renewable resource. Can you talk about the economic opportunities in the energy transition?
Exactly. And I'll actually step maybe even another 25,000 feet higher and then kind of answer in a way that, hopefully spirals down. And that is one of the things that I think is really critical to think about is, I know one of the last administration's catchphrases was energy dominance, which, especially if we're sitting out in, down here in Texas, or especially out in the Texas oil fields, there is this fun chest thumping aspect to that. But I think when we really think about what energy does for us strategically, the broad theme of energy abundance is really what we want to focus on. And, obviously oil and gas are still central to that. It's 2/3 of our primary energy consumption, even almost to this day, here in our country. But I think energy abundance is a much more encompassing, it brings in wind and solar. I think as some of the advanced nuclear technologies mature, I think those come into the equation as well. And, I think what we have to think about is it's not so much about exporting molecules, which I think is, some of the focus that we had over the last few years. I think it's really there's sort of two things. I think on the domestic front, it's really about creating opportunity to revitalize our manufacturing sector, to make sure that, people can afford a level of energy supply and services that ensures a good standard of living and things like that. And then I think when we're thinking in foreign terms, it's not so much that we gain power by, exporting, tankers full of oil or full of liquefied natural gas or anything like that. Those play very important roles. But I think it's really about gaining strategic room and latitude for maneuver. And, we know that we're going to be tied into the global energy markets, including oil and gas pricing, probably for decades. I mean, basically, as long as we use this stuff, we're exposed in various ways to the global market. But I think getting to a point where you're able to disconnect yourself to a certain extent from events in regions that I think are strategically important, but maybe not as existentially important to our strategic interests as, for instance, the Indo-Pacific region. Attaining that latitude it's extremely important. I think that's what energy abundance, does for us. And I guess when I talk about energy transition, and I think this probably reflects some degree of Texan bias, is, the transition part in my mind, you always have to have that energy abundance part, subsumed into it. And I think the other side of this is we have to ask ourselves hard questions in terms of, there are costs associated with the transition. The way I put it is, I can bring my wife a bouquet of full stem roses, and, she loves the little red rose bulbs at the top, but you always have to remember that the stem has some pretty sharp thorns on it. And I think the energy transition is the same way. And we have to be prepared as we embrace the bulb at the top to also be willing to deal with the thorns on the stem, and to be mindful of the fact that, even if we were to be sitting in, California, New York, or Massachusetts, that some of these transitions, we've already seen it in the Appalachian region with coal. And I think we're going to see some of this stuff in fossil fuel producing regions in Texas and, the Western United States also. There are pain points as these processes unfold that we have to be, if we want to maintain the broad base of political support to actually execute, we've got to be very cognizant, and we have to be ready to take real concrete action that reflects a reality that a voice somewhere in rural America is just as valued as one, in an elite coastal bastion. And I think, to be very blunt, we're not there yet. And I think if we want some of these measures to succeed and deliver the benefits that I think people of all political stripes can see if you present it to them, we've got to really sincerely embrace that situation and be ready to deal with it.
Yeah, I like the phrase you use, that energy abundance. I mean, it is really important to people to have affordable energy that they can access in their daily life. It just improves human well-being, and it's most important for the Americans and for the others elsewhere in the world who are poorest. Right? It's just the biggest fraction of their annual budget is energy. So,
in some cases, I'll tell you, we've run some data recently. I took a data set of 200 countries, basically almost every country that had data in the CIA World Factbook. Just did a simple analysis. I looked at the amount of electricity generated per year, or consumed per year in that country, converted that into per capita terms, and then I looked at some World Health Organization data for water-related mortality, and it's a shockingly high correlation between, energy abundance, or maybe better put, lack of energy, and high rates of mortality from illnesses that are totally preventable. And the brunt of this toll is, borne by children, age 5 and younger, which hits pretty close to home for me, given I've got 3 that are age 7 or younger. And you realize, given how global markets are connected, our own energy abundance, obviously it does benefit us here first, but there's profound benefits elsewhere in the world. And if we do something that crimps our energy abundance domestically, that's a bad situation for Americans here. It's a really terrible situation if you're in parts of the world that are already severely beset by energy poverty, and for whom our energy abundance exported in various ways could actually dramatically improve their standard of living.
Absolutely. Well, Gabe Collins, thank you so much for making time to join us today. Really appreciate your thoughts. Would encourage the audience to check out this very thoughtful piece in Foreign Affairs recently on that dynamic that we discussed between the U.S. and China. We're grateful to have you, and audience, thank you for tuning in, and we'll look forward to the next discussion.
Yeah, thanks, appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just a quick thanks, not to keep anyone from the now long weekend, but just a quick thanks on behalf of the Federalist Society to both our speakers here, and well, I guess our moderator and our speaker. We thank you very much for the benefit of your valuable time and expertise. This great discussion will be posted as a podcast and later as a YouTube video. We'll send that around when that gets posted. Thanks to our audience for calling in. Keep an eye on your emails and our website for announcements about upcoming Zoom events like this one, registration information, and the like. With that, thanks very much for being with us. Till next time, we are adjourned.